Here's what our Prime Minister did last week. He permanently destroyed 20% of the population's faith in the entire Canadian banking system and stained the Canadian banking system's international reputation, I would say, for decades. And in any normal time, that in itself would have been enough to constitute sufficient grounds for a non-confidence vote for the government to be ousted. And that's only one of like the 7 things that happened last week that are of that magnitude. You can't even keep up with them. And so let's talk about this emergency for a minute. So imagine that you're on the side of Trudeau and the Trudeau government, and you're trying to make the case that this is an emergency that justifies the imposition of martial law. So what's the emergency exactly? Tell me, give me some evidence that there's an emergency of any sort.
If even a delegation of the Trudeau cabinet had walked down the streets of Ottawa, had enough of parkers that they could sit outdoors and spend 2 hours talking to some of these real people, this could have been washed away.
Most of the information that the government depended on was actually generated by the CBC. And so then we have this feedback loop, right? Well, there's that, yeah, and that's a whole other bloody insane catastrophe, that funding site was hacked by a crazy activist, and then that information was distributed, and that distribution of stolen information is technically illegal, and the media jumped on that, and the government capitalized on it, and it's got to be that they believe their own press. And that's so interesting because they bought the press and paid them to tell them what they wanted to hear, and now they believe it and justify their policy as a consequence of that.
30 plus people in his cabinet, they can't all share that fantasy. And if we have 30 people elevated
well,
to
then
the
how
offices,
else do you account for what they're doing? Because strategically it's a bloody disaster.
Because they genuflect. I put a note in the column that you kindly posted. I said heroes, and I was exaggerating. Where are the 5 or 6 people in his own cabinet or in his own caucus that are saying, Justin, you have really, really overreached vastly. You have insulted the nature of this country, which is always the middle course, always the willingness to at least try a compromise and a talk. And you've introduced false drama, and that's my explanation. Mm-hmm. Maybe the melodramatic idea of a great national emergency that will flare across the world. Maybe he saw himself as a hero, but if you're following the international press, we're getting a real beating, and happy days or sunny days are not here again.
It's extraordinarily difficult to sample what the public thinks. And the reason we have institutions like Parliament, in fact, the actual reason we have institutions like Parliament is because that's a much better method of determining over a long period and in a sustained way what the public thinks when they're thinking carefully over multiple weeks, when many of them are together discussing, and when all of that's organized into something approximating a free political system. Opinion polls subvert all of that.
Not only that, here's another point that builds completely on what you just said. One of the functions, as old as there is a parliament, and especially the mother of all parliaments, of having these great, vast parliamentary reform bill of 1832, is that the debate itself is an agency of the establishment of public opinion. And if you don't have the arguments and the debate, then opinion has no way to fashion itself or to respond to, or to modify previous positions. You don't take a static, by the way, these polls are also highly suspect, but need that be?
Highly methodologically suspect in like 10
not only
different
methodologically, I think, I'll not say it out loud, I think some of them are partisan. But I go back to Parliament. Mm-hmm. If you cannot have a discussion in the parliamentary chamber of bringing in the most serious piece of legislation that we've seen, as you said, in 50 years, what is the point of Parliament? What is it?
Both Chrystia Freeland and Trudeau are integrally associated with the World Economic Forum. And there's a globalist agenda. This sounds like right-wing propaganda, I suppose, but there is a globalist elite agenda that is aimed at severely modifying the manner in which our fundamental institutions operate. under the, what would you call, the impetus of yet another crisis, which is the hypothetical climate crisis. And I'm an admirer of Bjorn Lomborg. I think he's done the best work on this matter, all things considered. Methodologically, he's got the best methodology for determining how to analyze what steps should be taken to deal with environmental concerns. I'm not going to call them emergencies. He's documented it very carefully, and I defy anyone on the climate catastrophe side to show evidence of a methodology more sophisticated than Bjorn Lomborg's in terms of analyzing an actual pathway forward that isn't merely apocalyptic neuroticism and the desire for totalitarian control. And so that's all lurking in the background. And that's also pulling the country apart in all sorts of ways, and it's underneath events like the fact that this attack occurred in northern BC the other day on the project
Coastal
designed
GasLink.
to the coastal gas exactly that's part of the attempt to ensure that we all have cheap, reliable energy as we move forward into the future. And so, I'm going to make it one more case about this. I worked on the UN Secretary General's report on sustainable development for 2 years and analyzed all this sort of material data. And that's where I came across Lomborg, trying to sort this stuff out. And one of the things I learned from doing that was really heartening to me and also kind of catastrophically emotion provoking was that if you look deeply into the data from as many different perspectives as you could manage, let's say with an open heart, the conclusion that you would derive is that the faster we can get cheap energy to the world's poor people, and the cheaper that energy is, and that's mostly going to be fossil fuels, especially natural gas, if we can do it right, the faster we're going to move towards clean energy in general, the richer people are going to get, and the more sustainable environmental movement we can have in the future. We make the poorest people rich by giving them access to cheap energy, mostly facilitated by fossil fuel. That's the best possible move forward for the planet and for those who are absolutely poor. And again, I defy anyone on the environmental catastrophe side to formulate an argument showing how that's not true. You say, I'm on the side of the oppressed, I'm on the side of the poor. It's like, you're not. If you're not for cheap energy, you're not on that side at all.
We just put in over $500 billion of the deficit, over $1 trillion of the debt. Oil is now ramping up to $80 or $100 a barrel, and the Canadian government has seized Alberta, built a concrete wall around it, and the greatest natural resource we have is frozen. Here's one for you. Maybe the emergencies that we're seeing this week, I don't know. Maybe this is one way of forestalling the knowledge that they have got it.
There's nothing more psychologically attractive than a false crisis to divert attention from a real crisis. And I've been talking with people who are in the economic know in a very profound manner and who've demonstrated that in a variety of different ways. And one of the facts that was pointed out to me rather forcefully over the last month was that over the last 15 years, Canada's gross domestic product per capita has remained relatively constant at $43,000, while the Americans has moved from approximately that to $65,000. And so that's just one of many indicators that Canada is in a state of economic crisis, the magnitude of which has not yet been entirely revealed, and that the country is tearing itself apart at the seams.
This is a sad, sad mess, and I'll tell you this for sure, that in the immediate future, in the next 12 months, we're going to hear so many ramifications out of this. We've done a great injury that may not be easily repaired over time. And that's the biggest worry of all. It isn't the convoy, and it isn't declaring it a protest. It's the nature of the country and the harmony that once it knew.
Unprecedented times in our country, and what a bloody catastrophe that is. And I've not been an admirer of Trudeau since he decided, inappropriately in my mind, to run for office despite lacking all the necessary qualifications for doing so, except the unearned fame of his name. But having said all that, that doesn't mean I wish that he would reside over the destruction of the country as evidence of his incompetence. And I guess I would also say, maybe I'll ask you this too, I cannot see how his government can survive the next month. What do you think? What's your prediction?
I am much more pessimistic than you. We have to see, because this is in the middle. This is extremely dynamic. I wrote their little tiny thing. You know, we had Mr. Trudeau knew what he was doing when he called the election earlier last year. This is an issue, but we won't see an election on it. Mr. Singh, as you pointed out, has become the tattered tail of a not very noble kite. And the funny thing that the Separatist Party in Quebec is actually opposing this. The greatest Canadians in Parliament are the Separatists. No, I'm laughing, but I'm not.
Yeah,
I think it's a sad time.
Yes.
It's a sad time. It's a serious time. Well, wait here. This is what I'd like to say in conclusion, really, because I haven't been that specific. There were a lot of those men and women that came for 2 or 3 whole weeks. They were showing a good spirit, and they had their parties. But you know this was hard. They had to spend the money. They got their money seized by the government. They're out there being mocked by the majority of the Canadian press. They don't want to be 3 months in January and February squatting in a truck in front of a Parliament building in the middle of
minus 20.
Storm. So you know something? Now they got the long drive back, and they have been booted out of their national capital. I just say to them, if they listen to you and me on this particular thing, I think you did good stuff, and I think you deserve a hell of a lot more
Thank
support.
God for the working class.
Yeah,
That's
well,
what
the
I
working
think.
class is what keeps the country working.